The story opens in the harsh wilderness of Texas in 1858, 2 years before the American Civil War. Under the burning sun, a line of enslaved black men struggles across the desert on foot. Heavy iron shackles bind their ankles together, while two slave traders, Ace and Dickie Speck, ride alongside them on horseback. Among the prisoners is Django, a man who has already lost almost everything. After being sold at an auction, he was torn away from his wife, Broomhilda von Schaft. He has no idea where she has been taken, but the thought of finding her remains the only thing keeping him moving forward. When night falls, the Speck brothers continue leading their captives through the darkness. Their journey is unexpectedly interrupted by a strange man approaching from the road. A small tooth-shaped sign sways above his carriage, and the stranger awkwardly guides his horse toward the group while carrying a lantern. He introduces himself as Dr. King Schultz, a German immigrant who once worked as a dentist. Dentistry, however, is no longer his profession. Schultz now earns his living as a bounty hunter. Ace immediately becomes suspicious. With little patience for unexpected visitors, he demands that Schultz explain why he has approached them. He warns the German that failure to provide a convincing answer could end with a bullet. Schultz remains polite and remarkably relaxed. He says he is merely a tired traveler searching for two slave traders known as the Speck brothers. Since Ace and Dickie are standing directly in front of him, his search has clearly reached its destination. But Schultz has not come to purchase just any enslaved man. He is specifically looking for someone who can identify three wanted criminals known as the Brittle Brothers. Schultz believes the Specks bought several men at an auction in Greenville, and one of those prisoners may have previously worked on the Caroquin plantation. Turning toward the chained men, Schultz asks whether any of them once belonged to that plantation. Django answers. Schultz lifts his kerosene lamp and carefully examines the prisoners until he finds the man who spoke. Once he identifies Django, he asks what he knows about the Brittle Brothers. Django names all three of them, Big John, Ellis and Roger, who is sometimes called Little Raj. He explains that the men served as overseers on the Caroquin plantation under his former owner. Schultz quickly corrects him. The Brittle Brothers no longer work as overseers. They are fugitives with rewards placed on their heads, and Schultz intends to locate them. What matters is whether Django could recognize their faces if he saw them again. Before Django can properly respond, Ace orders Schultz to stop questioning him. In Ace's mind, Django is property, and a stranger has no right to speak with him without permission. Still keeping his composure, Schultz explains that he is attempting to arrange a legitimate purchase. He wants to buy Django and is prepared to pay a reasonable amount. Ace refuses. He tells Schultz that Django is not available for sale and becomes increasingly aggressive when the German refuses to leave. Eventually, Ace draws his weapon and aims it directly at Schultz. Rather than panicking, Schultz calmly asks whether Ace is simply being theatrical or genuinely intends to shoot him. Ace makes his intentions clear, leaving Schultz with no reason to wait. In one swift movement, Schultz pulls his concealed pistol and fires. The bullet tears through Ace's head before he can react. Schultz immediately fires again, this time hitting Dickie's horse. The wounded animal collapses, trapping Dickie beneath its enormous body. Unable to move, Dickie screams in pain and fury while Schultz casually walks toward him. With dry sarcasm, Schultz apologizes for shooting the horse. He explains that he could not allow Dickie to do anything reckless before having time to think about the situation. Dickie continues yelling, but Schultz asks him to reduce the noise. He still has unfinished business with Django, and the screaming is making conversation difficult. Schultz returns to the chained men and continues exactly where he left off. Django confirms that he would recognize the Brittle Brothers if they appeared in front of him. That answer is enough. Schultz informs the injured Dickie that he will purchase Django for a fair price. He leaves payment behind, takes the necessary paperwork, and formally acquires Django. However, Schultz has no interest in continuing the Speck brothers' operation. Before riding away, he unlocks the remaining prisoners and leaves Dickie's fate in their hands. The newly freed men surround the trapped slave trader, armed with his own weapons. Schultz does not stay to see what follows. Django removes Ace's coat, takes his horse, and rides away beside Schultz. By the following day, the two men reach the small town of Daughtry, Texas. Their arrival immediately attracts attention. The townspeople stare from their windows and porches because they have never seen a black man riding freely on horseback, especially beside a white man. Django and Schultz enter the local saloon, but the innkeeper reacts with panic the moment he sees Django inside. Rather than serve them, the man runs out of the building to find the authorities. With the saloon temporarily abandoned, Schultz steps behind the bar and helps himself to drinks. He then explains the real reason he purchased Django. Schultz describes bounty hunting as a profession that profits from death. Slave traders earn money by buying and selling living human beings, while bounty hunters receive payment for delivering wanted criminals to the law, usually after killing them. He openly admits that he despises slavery, yet he also understands that Django's legal status can be manipulated to serve their immediate purpose. Schultz needs Django because he has never seen the Brittle brothers. Django, on the other hand, knows exactly what they look like. His proposal is simple. Django will help locate and identify the three fugitives. Once they are found, Django will be allowed to kill them himself. In return, Schultz promises him his freedom and a payment of $75. For Django, the offer provides more than revenge. Freedom would finally give him the chance to search for Broomhilda. He accepts. The two soon leave town and continue their journey together. During the ride, Schultz asks Django what he intends to do after earning his freedom. Django explains that he plans to find his wife and purchase her freedom as well. Schultz is surprised to learn that Django is married. He becomes even more interested when Django tells him his wife's full name, Broomhilda von Schaft. The name immediately sounds familiar to Schultz because it is German. Django explains that Broomhilda was raised by German-speaking owners from the von Schaft family. Because she worked inside their home, she learned to understand and speak a small amount of German. Her name comes from an old German legend, which creates an unexpected connection between Schultz and the woman Django is desperate to rescue. Their immediate objective, however, is still the Brittle brothers. The trail leads them toward Tennessee, where Schultz believes the fugitives are working on a plantation. Before entering the property, he and Django find a place to stay and prepare their cover story. They cannot simply arrive and announce that they are hunting three plantation workers. Their presence must appear legitimate, especially because Django will be riding beside Schultz as a free man. Schultz decides they will pose as businessmen. Django will act as his valet, a personal servant accompanying him during an important transaction. The disguise should allow them to enter the plantation, observe its workers and search for the Brittle brothers without immediately revealing their true purpose. To make the performance convincing, Django needs suitable clothing. Schultz allows him to select whatever outfit he wants. After spending his life being ordered what to wear, where to stand and how to behave, Django is finally given a choice of his own. He studies the available clothes and prepares to step into a new role, one that will bring him closer to the men who brutalized him and closer to the freedom he needs to begin searching for Broomhilda. Schultz and Django soon arrive at the Tennessee plantation owned by Spencer, Big Daddy Bennett. To gain access without raising suspicion, Schultz pretends to be interested in purchasing one of Bennett's enslaved workers. Big Daddy is intrigued by the possibility of making a profitable sale and welcomes them onto the property. Since Schultz claims he wants to inspect the plantation before discussing business, Bennett orders one of the enslaved house servants, Bettina, to escort Django around the estate. Django's unusual clothing and confident behavior immediately make her uncertain about how she should address him. He is black, yet he is riding freely, carrying a weapon and accompanying a wealthy white businessman. Django makes it clear that, for the moment, she should treat him as someone with authority. As Bettina guides him across the enormous plantation, Django quietly asks whether she knows three men called the Brittle brothers. She does not recognize the name, but Django realizes the fugitives may be working under new identities. He describes them more carefully, hoping that their appearance or behavior will sound familiar. Bettina eventually mentions three brothers known on the plantation as the Schaffers. They arrived sometime earlier and now work for Big Daddy. Her description immediately confirms Django's suspicion. The Brittle brothers have simply changed their names. She explains that one of them, Ellis, is currently working somewhere across the fields. The other two are near the stables, where they are punishing a young enslaved woman named Jody for breaking some eggs. The moment Django hears this, his calm expression disappears. He orders Bettina to find Schultz and bring him to the stable. Django then heads there alone. When he arrives, he sees Big John and Little Raj tormenting Jody. The scene brings back painful memories of the violence Django and Broomhilda suffered under the same men. For him, this is no longer merely a bounty. It is personal. Django steps forward and confronts them. Big John barely has time to understand what is happening before Django shoots him. Little Raj immediately attacks, but Django knocks him down and beats him furiously. Years of anger pour out all at once as Django punishes the man who once held power over him. Little Raj attempts to reach for a weapon, forcing Django to finish the confrontation. He raises his gun and fires repeatedly, shooting him several times. Schultz finally arrives and looks over the bodies. Rather than questioning Django's methods, he simply asks whether the dead men are two of the wanted brittle brothers. Django confirms that they are. He then points toward the distant field and explains that Ellis, the final brother, is already running for his life. Schultz calmly prepares his rifle, aims across the plantation, and shoots Ellis before the fugitive can escape. The commotion brings Big Daddy and his men rushing to the area. Bennett is outraged that 2 visitors have killed 3 white employees on his property. Schultz, however, produces official wanted posters proving that the Brittle brothers were fugitives with lawful rewards on their heads. As a legally authorized bounty hunter, Schultz had the right to kill them. Big Daddy has little choice but to let the 2 men leave. That evening, however, Bennett gathers a large group of armed riders. Wearing crude masks over their heads, the posse travels into the darkness, determined to capture and kill Schultz and Django despite the legal warrants shown earlier. From a distance, Schultz and Django watch the riders approach their camp. Schultz has already anticipated the attack. Before leaving the plantation, he warned Bennett that interfering with an officer of the court while he was carrying out his duty could lead to execution. Big Daddy ignored the warning, believing the size of his posse would make him untouchable. The masked riders surround Schultz's old dentist wagon, convinced their targets are hiding inside or nearby. Instead, Schultz and Django are positioned safely on a hillside overlooking the road. Schultz has packed the wagon with explosives. Once the posse is close enough, he takes careful aim and fires at the carriage. The shot strikes its target perfectly, triggering a violent explosion that destroys the wagon and throws the attackers into chaos. Several riders are killed instantly, while the survivors flee in every direction. Big Daddy manages to escape the blast and gallops away through the darkness. Schultz hands the rifle to Django and tells him to take the shot. Django steadies the weapon, follows Bennett through the sights and fires. The bullet hits Big Daddy, knocking him from his horse and ending the threat. Later, Schultz and Django sit beside their campfire, eating and recovering from the violence of the day. Their conversation eventually returns to Broomhilda. When Schultz hears her name again, he explains that it comes from an old German legend. In the story, Broomhilda is a princess trapped on a mountain surrounded by fire. She can only be rescued by a hero brave enough to cross the flames and reach her. Schultz tells the tale with great enthusiasm, partly to entertain Django and partly because he recognizes the similarity between the legend and Django's own situation. Broomhilda has been taken away and placed somewhere beyond his reach. Django must now become the hero who finds her. The story leaves an impression on both men. Schultz also understands that simply setting Django free and sending him alone to Greenville would be irresponsible. Django has little money, no legal protection, and no idea where his wife was taken after their separation. Attempting to rescue her without preparation would almost certainly get him killed. Because of this, Schultz proposes a partnership. He suggests that Django remain with him through the winter and learn the bounty hunting trade. In return for his help, Django will receive 1/3 of every reward they collect. By the time the snow melts, he should have enough experience and money to begin searching for Broomhilda properly. Schultz also promises that he will personally accompany Django to Greenville. Together, they will investigate the records of the slave traders and determine who purchased her. Django accepts the offer. The 2 men return to Texas and begin working as bounty hunters. On their first mission together, they track a wanted outlaw named Smitty Backall and the other members of his gang. Django is given the responsibility of taking the shot. He positions himself with the rifle, carefully studies the target, and kills Smitty from a distance. After collecting the reward, Django keeps the outlaw's wanted poster as a souvenir of his first successful bounty. Schultz continues training him, teaching him how to read handbills, track fugitives, identify targets, and remain patient before firing. Django also practices his accuracy by shooting at a snowman, gradually becoming faster and more confident with every attempt. Throughout the winter, the pair travel from one location to another, collecting reward after reward. Django quickly proves himself to be a natural marksman. He no longer resembles the shackled prisoner Schultz encountered in Texas. He rides with confidence, understands the business, and shows little hesitation when facing dangerous criminals. By the arrival of spring, Schultz and Django have earned a considerable amount of money and eliminated several wanted men. With winter behind them, they finally begin the search for Broomhilda. Their investigation leads them into Mississippi, where the scale and brutality of slavery are even more visible. Enslaved people fill the streets, plantations stretch across the landscape, and human beings are openly bought and sold as property. After examining the sale records, Schultz and Django discover that Broomhilda has been purchased by Calvin J. Candy is the wealthy owner of Candyland, one of the largest cotton plantations in Mississippi. The estate is infamous not only for its size, but also for Calvin's cruelty and extravagant lifestyle. Django's first instinct is to travel directly to Candyland and offer to buy his wife. Schultz immediately rejects that approach. If Candy learns that Broomhilda has personal value to Django, he will either refuse to sell her or demand an impossible price. They need a reason to enter Candyland without revealing their real objective. Schultz develops a more complicated strategy. Instead of pretending to purchase an ordinary worker, they will pose as wealthy buyers interested in acquiring a fighter. Calvin Candy participates in what he calls mandingo fighting, a vicious form of entertainment in which enslaved men are forced to fight each other, sometimes to the death. Schultz believes that Candy's obsession with the sport can be used against him. Under the plan, Schultz will pretend to be a wealthy businessman from Dusseldorf who wishes to enter the mandingo fighting business. Django will act as his expert, someone supposedly trained to judge the strength, value, and fighting ability of enslaved men. Their false offer must be enormous enough to gain Calvin's attention. Schultz intends to discuss purchasing one of Candy's best fighters for $12,000. The sum is far greater than the normal price and should guarantee them an invitation to Candyland. Once inside, they can quietly locate Broomhilda and attempt to buy her for a much smaller amount, without revealing that she is the true reason for their visit. Schultz and Django arrange a meeting with Candy at a private gentleman's club. When they arrive, Calvin is watching two enslaved fighters engage in a savage match. The men are forced to attack each other while the wealthy spectators drink, gamble, and treat the violence as entertainment. Django refuses to show discomfort. His role requires him to behave like someone familiar with the brutality of the business. Although the fight disgusts him, he maintains a cold expression and pretends to study the men as valuable property rather than human beings. After the match, Schultz introduces himself to Calvin and begins discussing business. He explains that he is searching for an exceptional fighter and may be prepared to pay $12,000 for the right man. The offer immediately captures Calvin's interest. Few people would spend that amount on a single enslaved fighter, and Candy sees the possibility of a major profit. Django strengthens the performance by behaving arrogantly and speaking as though he has extensive experience judging mandingo fighters. His attitude convinces Calvin that Schultz's offer may be genuine. Intrigued, Candy invites both men to travel with him to Candyland, where they can inspect his fighters personally. The following day, as the group prepares to leave, Schultz finds a private moment to speak with Django. He reminds him that Broomhilda is somewhere on Candy's plantation, but warns him not to reveal his emotions when he sees her. If Django becomes reckless or attempts immediate revenge, their entire cover will collapse. Reaching Broomhilda is only possible if Calvin continues believing they are wealthy buyers interested in his fighting operation. Django assures him that he understands. They begin the journey toward Candyland with Calvin, his associates, and several armed trackers. While traveling through the countryside, the group encounters a disturbing scene in the woods. Candy's trackers have captured an escaped mandingo fighter named D'Artagnan. Several hunting dogs surround the exhausted man, preventing him from fleeing again. D'Artagnan once fought for Calvin, but his body has been severely damaged by repeated matches. He explains that he can no longer continue fighting and begs Candy for mercy. Calvin orders him to kneel and speak respectfully. He then questions the fighter about his most recent match and learns that D'Artagnan lost. Candy is not concerned about the man's injuries or suffering. He is furious because he paid a large amount of money for a fighter who is no longer profitable. He lectures D'Artagnan about reimbursement, treating the human being in front of him as nothing more than a failed investment. Schultz is visibly disturbed. Unable to tolerate the situation, he offers to reimburse Calvin for the money lost on D'Artagnan. Django quickly intervenes. He knows that Schultz's sympathy could expose them. A man pretending to purchase fighters for deadly combat would not suddenly risk their entire deal to save one escaped slave. Django coldly argues that D'Artagnan is Calvin's property, and therefore Calvin may handle him however he chooses. Candy studies Django's reaction and appears impressed by his apparent lack of compassion. He asks whether Django would object if the trackers dealt with D'Artagnan immediately. To protect their cover and preserve their only chance of reaching Broomhilda, Django says he has no objection. Calvin orders the trackers to release the dogs. Schultz is forced to remain silent as the animals attack D'Artagnan and tear him apart. The screams echo through the forest while Calvin and his men watch without concern. Django also watches, hiding every trace of anger behind the ruthless personality he has created. Although the decision clearly affects him, he cannot reveal it. One emotional reaction could destroy the plan and condemn Broomhilda before he even reaches her. Once the killing is over, Calvin casually continues toward Candyland as though nothing unusual has happened. When the group finally arrives at the plantation, Calvin's elderly house servant, Stephen, comes outside to welcome his master. He immediately freezes when he sees Django riding a horse alongside the white guests. The sight infuriates and confuses him. In Stephen's world, a black man should never be allowed to ride freely into Candyland, especially while dressed like a wealthy gentleman and carrying himself with authority. Calvin explains that Django is a free man and an important part of Schultz's business. He orders Stephen to control himself and treat both visitors with the respect expected of honored guests. Stephen reluctantly obeys, but his suspicious gaze remains fixed on Django. From the moment Django enters Candyland, it is clear that Stephen does not trust him. Once everyone settles into Candyland, Schultz casually asks Calvin to have Broomhilda cleaned up and brought inside. He claims that he heard she understands German and says he would enjoy speaking with someone in his native language. Calvin agrees without giving the request much thought. He calls Broomhilda by the shortened name Hildy and orders his servants to prepare her for their guest. Django soon discovers that Broomhilda has recently been punished for attempting to escape. She has been locked inside a small underground punishment box beneath the intense Mississippi heat. Hearing what has been done to her nearly destroys the calm exterior he has maintained since arriving. When the servants drag Broomhilda from the cramped metal chamber, Django sees her exhausted, terrified, and barely able to stand. His first instinct is to reach for his weapon and kill everyone responsible. His hand almost moves toward his gun, but he stops himself. He has come too far to lose control now. Any sudden reaction would reveal that Broomhilda means far more to him than an ordinary enslaved servant. Django forces himself to remain still while she is carried away, claimed and prepared to meet Schultz. Later that evening, Calvin's widowed sister, Lara Lee Candy Fitzwilly, escorts Broomhilda to Schultz's room. Schultz welcomes her politely and begins speaking only in German. He explains that using German gives them a small amount of privacy. Calvin's servants may be listening outside, but few people at Candyland can understand the language well enough to follow their conversation. At first, Broomhilda is nervous and confused. She believes Schultz may be another buyer interested in taking ownership of her. He quickly reassures her that he has not come to harm her. Schultz explains that he intends to purchase her while pretending she is merely an additional comfort for him during negotiations. The supposed Mandingo deal is only a cover. He and his partner came to Candyland specifically to find her and take her away. Broomhilda struggles to understand why a complete stranger would take such a dangerous risk for her. She asks who Schultz's companion really is. Schultz steps aside and allows Django to enter. The moment Broomhilda sees her husband, she is overwhelmed. For a second, she appears unable to believe that he is standing in front of her. Django gently approaches, confirming that he has finally found her after months of searching. Their reunion must remain quiet. Schultz warns both of them that Calvin cannot learn about their marriage until the sale has been completed. If he realizes how valuable Broomhilda is to Django, he will either refuse to sell her or use her to demand an outrageous amount of money. Django and Broomhilda, therefore, separate before anyone becomes suspicious. At dinner, Schultz continues performing the role of a wealthy buyer interested in Calvin's fighting operation. Calvin proudly discusses his enslaved fighters, while Django maintains the hard, detached attitude expected from a Mandingo expert. Broomhilda is brought into the dining room, where she attempts to act as though Django is a stranger. Their performance convinces most of the people at the table, but Stephen watches them closely. Unlike Calvin, Stephen notices the smallest changes in their behavior. He sees how Broomhilda reacts when Lara Lee makes a casual remark about Django. He notices the brief looks exchanged between them and realizes that their connection is not accidental. Stephen creates an excuse to speak privately with Calvin. Away from the dinner table, he tells his master that Schultz has no genuine interest in purchasing a Mandingo fighter. The $12,000 offer is a trick designed to gain access to Candyland. According to Stephen, Broomhilda is the real reason the visitors came. Calvin is initially doubtful, but Stephen explains that Django and Broomhilda clearly know each other. Once Calvin understands the deception, his friendly attitude disappears. Back in the dining room, Lara Lee continues speaking with Broomhilda. Her presence prevents Calvin and Stephen from immediately humiliating her, and it also gives Django time to control his anger. Calvin eventually orders almost everyone to leave. Only Django, Schultz, Calvin's lawyer, and a few trusted men remain. the atmosphere changes immediately. Calvin reveals that he knows the truth. Schultz never intended to spend $12,000 on the fighter called Eskimo Joe. The entire negotiation was designed to create an opportunity to purchase Broomhilda cheaply. Stephen brings her into the room and grips her violently by the neck. Calvin uses her fear to demonstrate that he now controls the situation. Rather than ending the transaction, Calvin offers them a new arrangement. He will still sell Broomhilda, but not for the small price Schultz intended to offer. If they want her alive, they must pay the same $12,000 supposedly reserved for Eskimo Joe. Calvin's armed men surround the room, making it clear that this is no longer a negotiation. Schultz tries to resist the demand, but Calvin places Broomhilda over the table and produces a hammer. He threatens to strike her skull if Schultz refuses to complete the purchase. Django remains silent, knowing that any movement could cause Calvin to kill her immediately. Unable to risk Broomhilda's life, Schultz agrees. He hands over the full amount, allowing Calvin to believe he has outsmarted them. The legal documents are prepared, and Broomhilda is officially sold to Schultz. Once the papers are signed, their objective is technically complete. They only need Calvin to surrender the documents and allow them to leave the plantation. Calvin, however, cannot resist humiliating Schultz one final time. He extends his hand and demands a handshake to complete the transaction. Schultz refuses. After everything he has witnessed, the forced fights, D'Artagnan's death, and Calvin's treatment of Broomhilda, he cannot bring himself to offer even a false gesture of respect. Calvin insists. He warns Schultz that unless they shake hands, the agreement will not be considered finished. Broomhilda's safety once again hangs over the threat. Schultz stares at Calvin's hand, realizing that there is only one act he can live with. He apologizes to Django for what he is about to do. Then he pulls the concealed pistol from his sleeve and shoots Calvin directly in the chest. Calvin collapses, mortally wounded. His bodyguard, Butch Pooch, reacts immediately and fires his rifle into Schultz. The bullet kills the bounty hunter before he can escape. Django responds without hesitation. He grabs his weapons and shoots Pooch, then turns his gun on Calvin's lawyer and the armed men filling the room. A violent firefight erupts throughout the mansion. Django moves through the halls, using doors, furniture, and bodies for cover while firing at Calvin's guards. One man after another falls as he fights his way through the house. For several moments, it appears that Django may be able to defeat everyone inside. His ammunition, however, begins to run low. Stephen and Billy crash seize Broomhilda and place a weapon against her. They threaten to kill her unless Django surrenders. Django has no choice. He drops his gun and allows the remaining men to take him alive. By the following day, Django is suspended naked and upside down inside a storage room. Billy Crash prepares to torture and castrate him, taking pleasure in describing what he intends to do. Before Billy can finish, Stephen enters with new instructions. Lara Lee, now responsible for Candyland after her brother's death, has decided that killing Django quickly would be too merciful. Instead, she plans to sell him to the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company. The company has a reputation for working enslaved men until they die. Once Django is taken there, he will spend the rest of his short life underground, breaking rocks and enduring treatment even worse than execution. Stephen proudly explains that Django will disappear into the mine and never see Broomhilda again. Soon afterward, Django is chained with several other enslaved men and transported away from Candyland. Armed guards escort the group toward the mining company. Django refuses to accept that his story is over. During the journey, he begins talking to the men transporting him. He claims that he is not an ordinary slave, but a professional bounty hunter who was wrongfully captured. The guards laugh at him until Django produces the handbill he kept from his first bounty with Schultz. The document shows the faces of wanted criminals and proves that Django knows details only a bounty hunter would understand. He then invents a story. Django tells the guards that the criminals pictured on the handbill are hiding at Candyland. The reward for killing them is supposedly large enough to make every member of the escort wealthy. If they release him and return with him to the plantation, he promises to divide the bounty among them. The guards remain suspicious, but the other chained prisoners support Django's claim. They confirm that he behaves differently from an ordinary field worker and appears to understand weapons and bounty hunting. Greed eventually overcomes the escort's caution. They release Django from his chains and hand him a rifle so he can lead them to the supposed fugitives. The moment Django has a weapon, he turns it on them. He kills the guards, frees himself completely, and takes their guns, horses, and dynamite. The other prisoners are left with the means to escape, while Django rides back toward Candyland. He returns to the plantation determined to rescue Broomhilda, avenge Schultz and punish everyone involved in D'Artagnan's death. His first stop is the trackers' camp. The men who released the dogs on D'Artagnan are relaxing inside their shelter when Django arrives. Before they can organize themselves, he attacks, killing the trackers and eliminating their dogs. Afterward, he heads toward the barn where Schultz's body has been stored. Django searches his fallen friend and finds Broomhilda's signed freedom papers. He takes the documents, ensuring that once she escapes, no one can legally claim ownership of her again. Before leaving, Django pauses beside Schultz. He gently touches the bounty hunter's head and silently says goodbye. Schultz began as a stranger who needed Django's help, but over time he became his teacher, partner, and closest ally. Without him, Django would never have gained the freedom or skill required to return. Now Django intends to complete the mission they started together. While most of Candeland's residents attend Calvin's burial, Django moves toward the small structure where Broomhilda is being held. With the plantation temporarily quiet, he kills the guards and frees her. He shows her the papers proving that she is legally free. Django then places Broomhilda somewhere safe and returns to the mansion to prepare for the others. By nightfall, Lara Lee, Stephen, Billy Crash, and the remaining armed men come back from Calvin's funeral. They believe Django is already on his way to the mining company and have no reason to expect an attack. Django is waiting inside. He confronts them in the main hall, now dressed in Calvin's clothing and carrying multiple weapons. Billy reaches for his gun, but Django shoots him before he can respond. The remaining guards are killed moments later. Lara Lee attempts to escape the room, but Django fires, sending her flying through the doorway. Only Stephen and two enslaved house servants remain. Django tells the two women that they may leave. Before they go, he gives them a moment to say goodbye to Lara Lee and the destroyed Candy household. Stephen refuses to move. Even after Calvin's death and Candeland's collapse, he continues insulting Django and insisting that he will never truly escape. Django shoots Stephen in both knees, leaving him helpless on the floor. He then reveals that he has placed dynamite throughout the mansion. Stephen's confidence finally disappears. He screams after Django as he walks outside, begging him to stop. Django ignores him. Once he reaches a safe distance, he lights the fuse. The explosives detonate throughout Candeland, tearing the mansion apart in a massive fireball. Stephen disappears inside the destruction as the home that represented Calvin's wealth and cruelty collapses around him. From a nearby hill, Broomhilda watches the plantation burn. Django joins her on horseback, and the two share a quiet moment after everything they have survived. She smiles as he performs a final display with his horse, enjoying the freedom he fought so hard to earn. Together, they turn away from the burning remains of Candeland and ride into the darkness. Django began the story walking through Texas in chains. He ends it as a free man beside his wife, armed, confident, and feared by anyone foolish enough to stand in his way, the man who will soon be remembered as the fastest. The easiest way to recognize Django Unchained as a Quentin Tarantino film is that almost every scene feels like it has passed through his private collection of movies first. The Western imagery is there, obviously, but he isn't interested in making a clean, traditional Western. He takes pieces from spaghetti westerns, blaxploitation films, grindhouse cinema, and old revenge stories, then forces them into the same movie until they start forming something that feels unmistakably his. That is why calling it a Western only tells part of the story. Most of the film takes place in the American South rather than the familiar frontier landscape, so Southern is probably the more accurate description. The characters may wear the hats, carry the guns, and enter scenes like legendary Western figures, but the world around them is built on plantations, slavery, and the social structure of the pre-Civil War South. Tarantino uses the visual language of a Western while telling a story that belongs somewhere else geographically and historically. He makes that intention clear almost immediately. The old-fashioned studio logo, the bright red credits, and the original Django theme are not subtle references. They are announcements. Tarantino wants the audience to know exactly which shelf of film history he is pulling from. Even Franco Nero, the star of the 1966 Django, appears for a brief exchange built around the pronunciation of Django's name. It is a small joke, but it says a lot about Tarantino's approach. He is not remaking the original film or continuing its story. He is acknowledging it, borrowing its aura, and then moving in a completely different direction. That kind of reference-heavy filmmaking can become exhausting when it feels like the director is showing off his collection. Here, though, most of it fits the world he is creating. The dramatic zooms, the theatrical entrances, the exaggerated costumes, and the sudden bursts of violence all belong to the same heightened reality. Nothing is especially restrained, but restraint was never really the goal. Tarantino wants Django to look larger than life. He wants Schultz to speak like he has wandered in from a more sophisticated film. He wants Calvin Candy's plantation to feel both historical and strangely artificial, almost like a stage built for an inevitable act of revenge. The result is less a recreation of the past than a movie fantasy constructed from other movies. Historical accuracy frequently takes a back seat to visual impact. Some of the clothing feels designed more for a Western icon than for a man living in the South in 1858. Django's outfits become part of his transformation, and Tarantino knows that a striking silhouette can communicate more quickly than a page of dialogue. A free black man riding a horse with a gun at his side becomes a deliberately impossible image within that society. The film treats that image with the same excitement another movie might reserve for the arrival of a superhero. Then there is the dialogue, another part of Tarantino's identity that has become increasingly difficult to separate from his self-indulgence. His early films had long conversations, but they often felt sharp enough that every pause carried some purpose. By the time of Django Unchained, those scenes had started stretching further. Characters do not simply exchange information. They perform. Schultz circles around a point with perfect manners. Candy enjoys hearing himself speak. Stephen watches, interrupts, and slowly begins controlling the room. When those conversations work, they are gripping because violence always seems close. A polite sentence can become a threat halfway through. A business negotiation can suddenly reveal who has understood the situation and who has not. Tarantino is very good at letting people talk, while quietly changing the balance of power between them. But there are moments when the talking feels like Tarantino, enjoying his own writing a little too much. The film occasionally pauses because a scene is amusing, not because the story needs it. The masked writers arguing about their badly cut eye holes are a perfect example. Some viewers consider it one of the funniest moments in the movie. Others see it as a long detour involving characters who disappear immediately afterward. Both reactions make sense. The scene is pure Tarantino, funny, oddly specific, slightly overextended and confident enough to assume the audience will follow wherever he goes. His use of music follows the same instinct. The older Western themes connect the film directly to the movies that inspired it, while the modern tracks deliberately break any sense of historical purity. That combination works brilliantly for some scenes because it makes Django's rise feel immediate rather than trapped inside a museum version of the past. At other points, the collision can be distracting. A modern hip-hop track playing over Western imagery is either an inspired act of reinvention or an interruption, depending on how willing the viewer is to accept Tarantino's rules. That is really the experience of Django Unchained as a whole. Tarantino borrows constantly, but the finished film never feels anonymous. The influences are visible, sometimes almost aggressively so, yet the mixture belongs to him. Few directors would combine slavery, broad comedy, Italian Western music, modern rap, extended monologues, and cartoonishly violent gunfights, and even fewer could make those pieces feel as though they were designed to occupy the same world. The flaws also come from that same confidence. Tarantino rarely seems willing to remove an idea simply because the film might be tighter without it. His cameo is the clearest example. Surrounded by a cast this strong, his own acting feels awkward and distracting, but he includes himself anyway. It is another reminder that the film is being controlled by a director who enjoys leaving his fingerprints everywhere. Still, that complete lack of anonymity is one of the movie's greatest strengths. Whether a scene is brilliant, excessive, or both at once, it never feels as though it could have been directed by anyone else. Django Unchained may be assembled from decades of genre cinema, but the final shape is pure Tarantino. Knowledgeable, provocative, funny, violent, and just self-indulgent enough to occasionally test the patience of the same audience it is entertaining. The story begins with Django having almost no control over where he is going or what happens to him. He is chained to a group of enslaved men, being marched through the cold by the Speck brothers, when Dr. King Schultz appears in the middle of the road with a strange dentist's wagon and an even stranger way of speaking. Schultz is looking for 3 wanted men called the Brittle Brothers, and Django is the only person who can identify them. Their first interaction is not exactly heroic. Schultz does not free Django because he has suddenly decided to rescue a stranger from slavery. He needs information, Django has it, and buying him is the quickest legal route available. The relationship starts as a transaction, which is important because the film allows it to develop gradually, instead of pretending these 2 men immediately trust each other. Schultz offers Django a clear deal. Help him locate the Brittle brothers, and Django will receive his freedom, a horse and a share of the reward. Django accepts because there is no real downside. He has just gone from being treated as property to being asked for his knowledge, and even though Schultz still controls the situation, this is the first time someone has presented him with anything resembling a choice. The search for the Brittle brothers gives the film its first straightforward mission. Django recognizes the men responsible for abusing him and Broomhilda, while Schultz provides the legal framework that allows him to kill them and collect a bounty. It is revenge disguised as official business, and Django adjusts to that arrangement very quickly. The idea that he can hunt white men, shoot them, and actually be paid for it almost sounds unreal to him. For the audience, it is the first sign that the film is building toward a much larger reversal of power. Once that job is finished, Schultz could simply release Django and move on. Instead, he makes another proposal. Django can work with him through the winter, learn the bounty hunting trade, and receive a third of the money they earn. When the season ends, Schultz will help him find Broomhilda. This is where the film slows down and allows the partnership to become more than a plot device. Schultz teaches Django how to shoot, how to approach wanted men, and how to survive in situations where almost everyone around them is disturbed by the sight of a free black man on horseback. Django, meanwhile, becomes useful for reasons that go well beyond recognizing the Brittle brothers. He learns fast, keeps his nerve, and gradually starts operating as Schultz's equal rather than his assistant. The bounty hunting section is fairly episodic. They travel, locate fugitives, set traps, and collect rewards. Some of these scenes could probably have been shortened without damaging the larger story, but they serve a purpose beyond giving Django target practice. We need to see him become capable. If the film moved directly from his liberation to the rescue at Candyland, his transformation into an expert gunslinger would feel too convenient. The winter gives him experience, money, and maybe most importantly, confidence. It also gives the film time to establish the chemistry between Django and Schultz. Schultz does most of the talking, because of course he does. He can turn a simple explanation into a small theatrical performance. Django usually watches, listens, and says only what is necessary. That difference creates a surprisingly comfortable rhythm between them. Schultz understands how to manipulate a room through language. Django learns how to read one before acting. Their friendship is not announced in a sentimental scene. It appears through smaller choices. Schultz takes Django seriously when he explains that Broomhilda is still enslaved. He could dismiss the rescue as too dangerous or simply give Django his share of the money and leave him to handle it alone. Instead, he becomes personally invested. By the time they begin searching for her, the original business agreement has almost disappeared. Schultz is helping because he wants Django to succeed. Finding Broomhilda is not difficult in itself. Schultz uses his contacts and discovers that she has been sold to Calvin Candy, the owner of a Mississippi plantation called Candyland. Getting her out is the real problem. Django cannot simply arrive and ask to buy her. An enslaved woman with no unusual market value could suddenly become extremely expensive if Candy realized how badly they wanted her. Worse, any emotional reaction between Django and Broomhilda could expose their relationship before they had a chance to complete the purchase. So Schultz comes up with a more elaborate plan than the situation seems to require, which is very much in character for both him and the film. He and Django pretend to be interested in purchasing a Mandingo fighter. Schultz poses as a wealthy buyer willing to spend an absurd amount of money, while Django adopts the role of an experienced black slaver who evaluates fighters on behalf of white clients. The disguise is ugly, particularly for Django, because it requires him to behave with open cruelty toward other enslaved people. But that cruelty is also what makes the performance believable. A polite or visibly sympathetic Django would never be accepted as part of this world. Their false business offer attracts Candy's attention. He enjoys money, spectacle, and the chance to impress wealthy strangers, so he invites them back to Candyland. From the outside, the plan seems to be working almost perfectly. They have gained access to the plantation, Broomhilda is nearby, and Candy believes he is negotiating a much larger transaction. The tension comes from how many things can go wrong without anyone firing a gun. Django has to remain emotionally detached when he sees Broomhilda. Schultz must keep Candy interested without committing himself to the expensive purchase they are pretending to negotiate. Broomhilda has to understand what is happening without revealing that she knows either man. Every conversation becomes a performance, and one wrong expression could destroy the entire plan. Calvin Candy is dangerous, but he is not the first person to realize something is wrong. That role belongs to Steven. While Candy is enjoying Schultz's attention and imagining the money he might make, Steven watches Django and Broomhilda more carefully. He notices the familiarity between them. he also understands that Django's behavior does not quite match the identity he is presenting. That discovery changes the rescue mission completely. Until then, the plan depends on deception and patience. Once Steven tells Candy what he suspects, the negotiation becomes a trap. Candy is no longer trying to impress his guests. He is forcing them to admit why they came and making sure they pay for attempting to deceive him. The film spends a long time reaching this point, but the structure is clearer than it first appears. The opening explains how Django becomes free. The winter section shows how he becomes capable. The journey to Candyland forces him to use what he has learned, not only as a shooter, but as someone who can control his emotions and perform under pressure. Then the plan collapses, and the film appears to reach its natural climax with the first major Candyland confrontation. Schultz can no longer tolerate Candy, Django is exposed, and the careful rescue operation gives way to chaos. For a moment, it seems as though every thread is about to be resolved through one enormous gunfight, but Tarantino keeps the story going. That decision creates the film's most obvious structural problem. After such a large confrontation, Django is captured, transported away, escapes, and then returns to Candyland for another ending. It can feel like the movie has already reached its climax and is now building toward a second one because Tarantino wants a more triumphant final image. At the same time, the extended ending completes Django's character arc in a way the first confrontation cannot. Until that point, Schultz has created the plans, handled the negotiations, and provided the legal or social protection. Django has become highly capable, but he is still working within Schultz's strategy. Once he is alone, he has to escape through his own intelligence, return by his own choice, and finish the rescue without his mentor. That second mission is much less complicated. There is no careful business proposal, and no need to win Candy's trust. Django has already learned everything he needs, and the people at Candyland now know exactly who he is. The elaborate rescue plan has failed, so he replaces it with direct retaliation. The result is structurally messy, but emotionally clear. What begins as Schultz purchasing Django for information becomes a story about Django gaining the skills and independence to free himself completely. Broomhilda remains the objective holding the plot together, but the journey toward her also becomes Django's education. He starts the film in chains, follows Schultz through the middle, and eventually returns to Candyland as the person making every decision. The bounty hunting, false identities, and double climax make the story feel longer than it strictly needs to be. Still, removing too much would weaken the sense that Django has actually earned his transformation. By the time he comes back for Broomhilda, he is not simply the enslaved man Schultz happened to free on a dark road. He has become the one person Candyland was never designed to survive. The most difficult thing about Django Unchained is also the reason the film has so much energy. Tarantino takes slavery, one of the ugliest parts of American history, and places it inside an exploitation movie. He does not approach the subject like a conventional historical drama. There is no attempt to make the film calm, respectable, or emotionally restrained from beginning to end. Instead, slavery becomes the foundation of a revenge western filled with comedy, swagger, theatrical villains, and impossible amounts of blood. That choice is bound to make people uncomfortable, and honestly, it probably should. For some viewers, the entire concept crosses a line. The suffering of enslaved people is real historical trauma, while Tarantino's film is deliberately entertaining. It asks the audience to laugh, enjoy the gunfights, and cheer when Django starts killing the men who support the plantation system. There is always going to be a question hanging over that approach. Is the film confronting slavery, or is it using slavery to make the revenge feel more exciting? The answer is not completely simple because it does both. Tarantino absolutely uses the cruelty of slavery to create villains the audience will want to see punished. Calvin Candy and the men around him are not written with much interest in moral redemption. They are there to represent a system so casually evil that violent retaliation begins to feel emotionally reasonable. The more the film shows us of Candyland, the less patience we are expected to have for anyone who keeps it functioning. At the same time, the film does not treat every act of cruelty as a piece of stylish entertainment. Some of its most disturbing scenes become noticeably quieter. The hot box sequence, for example, is hard to watch because Tarantino briefly removes most of the playfulness that normally defines his direction. There is no exaggerated punchline waiting at the end of it. Broomhilda is pulled from a place designed to punish and break her, and the reactions around her tell us just how ordinary this treatment has become. That normality is important. Candy does not behave like a man who believes he is doing something unusual. Neither do his employees. Human beings are bought, sold, beaten and forced to entertain their owners, and everyone inside that society has learned to discuss it as business. The horror is not only that violence happens, it is that the people with power have built routines around it. The Mandingo fighting material pushes this even further. Men are forced to hurt each other for the amusement of people who see them as investments. Tarantino films the brutality aggressively, but the scene is not satisfying in the way Django's later gunfights are. There is no sense of freedom in it. The violence belongs entirely to the slave owners, and that difference changes how the audience experiences it. When Django eventually turns violence back against these people, the style changes. Blood becomes excessive. Bodies fly across rooms. The action moves so far beyond realism that it becomes fantasy. That separation feels deliberate. The violence used to control enslaved people is ugly and degrading. Django's violence is presented as liberation, even when it is just as brutal physically. Of course, that distinction does not erase the discomfort. A revenge fantasy can provide emotional release, but it cannot undo the history underneath it. Tarantino is not seriously suggesting that one unstoppable gunslinger could have solved slavery with enough bullets. He is imagining the kind of victory that history did not allow, then presenting it with the confidence of an old Western legend. That is where the film connects most clearly with Inglourious Basterds. In that movie, Tarantino rewrote the end of the Second World War to give his characters an impossible act of revenge. Here, he does something similar with the American slave era. He takes people who were denied power by history and gives one of them almost mythic control over his own story. The fantasy is personal rather than political, though. Django does not begin a movement or attempt to free every enslaved person he encounters. His mission is Broomhilda. He wants his wife back, and everything else becomes secondary to that goal. That focus makes the story easier to follow emotionally, but it also creates a moral complication that the film does not completely avoid. Django sometimes allows other enslaved people to remain in danger because intervening could expose him. During the Candyland performance, he behaves cruelly toward people who are trapped in the same system he escaped. He understands their suffering, but he still uses it as part of his disguise. It is difficult to watch because Django's role requires more than silence. He has to convince Candy that he belongs among men who buy and evaluate human beings. Sympathy would make him suspicious, so he suppresses it. In those moments, freedom does not automatically make him noble. It gives him choices, and some of those choices are ugly. That prevents Django from becoming a perfectly clean symbol of justice. He is heroic because of what he is fighting for, but the film does not pretend that every decision he makes is selfless. He is prepared to let harm continue if it brings him closer to Broomhilda. His revenge is justified emotionally, yet it remains intensely personal. The racial language produces another layer of argument around the film. Tarantino refuses to soften the way these characters speak. Slurs are repeated constantly, not only during moments of direct violence but in ordinary conversation. The language shows how racism is built into the environment rather than limited to a few openly monstrous people. There is logic to that. A film set within plantation society would feel dishonest if every character spoke with modern sensitivity. The casual language helps reveal how completely black people are denied dignity within this world. Racism is not treated as bad behavior committed by isolated individuals. It is the social order. Still, the sheer frequency can feel provocative for its own sake. Tarantino has always been comfortable writing racial language, sometimes more comfortable than parts of his audience are willing to accept. Because of that history, viewers may question whether every use is necessary or whether he occasionally enjoys the shock attached to the word. The dialogue is not completely authentic in every other respect either. Characters often speak with a modern sharpness or comic rhythm because Tarantino values personality over strict reconstruction. That makes the argument about historical accuracy more complicated. The racial language is defended as truthful to the period, while other parts of the dialogue are freely stylized whenever the scene benefits from it. This is one of the film's contradictions. It wants the freedom of a fantasy and the force of historical reality at the same time. It wants Django to feel like a legendary Western hero, but it also wants the suffering around him to carry genuine weight. Sometimes those two intentions strengthen each other. Sometimes they feel like they are fighting for control of the same scene. The film's version of the South is also a direct rejection of the romantic plantation imagery found in older Hollywood movies. Candyland is visually impressive, but there is nothing noble beneath the surface. The mansion, elegant clothing, and formal dinners exist because enslaved people are being exploited outside the frame and often directly inside it. Candy likes to present himself as a cultured gentleman, yet his wealth and authority depend on cruelty. His interest in European manners, expensive business deals, and intellectual conversation does not make him civilized. If anything, it makes him more disturbing. He has enough education to decorate his violence, but not enough humanity to question it. Stephen adds an even more uncomfortable dimension. The film's racial conflict is not divided neatly between white oppressors and black victims. Stephen is enslaved, yet he has invested his identity in maintaining Candy's power. He monitors the plantation, distrusts Django, and protects the system that gives him limited authority over others. His role does not excuse the white characters or suggest that everyone shares equal responsibility. Stephen survives inside a structure he did not create, but he has survived so successfully that defending it has become part of who he is. He recognizes that Django represents something dangerous, not merely a rescue attempt, but a black man who refuses the position that Candyland has assigned him. Django's presence destabilizes the plantation before he even fires a weapon. He rides a horse. He wears expensive clothes. He speaks to white men as an associate rather than a servant. The film understands the power of those images. In this setting, his confidence is itself an act of rebellion. That is also why Tarantino leans so heavily into Western mythology. Traditional Westerns often revolve around a lone man entering a corrupt place and restoring justice through violence. Django Unchained takes that familiar fantasy and gives the role to someone who would normally have been denied even basic freedom in the genre's historical world. The result is not a realistic account of slavery, and it never seriously pretends to be. It is a violent correction written in the language of movies. Django cannot change what happened historically, but within this invented world, he can walk into the plantation, survive its attempts to destroy him, and leave with the person it tried to take away. That emotional reversal is why the revenge works as strongly as it does. The film spends so much time showing a society built on ownership that watching Django refuse to be owned becomes satisfying before the shooting even starts. Every choice he makes, every weapon he carries, and every room he enters challenges the rules around him. Whether that makes the film a powerful condemnation of slavery or a reckless exploitation of it depends heavily on the viewer. There is evidence for both reactions. Tarantino treats the subject with genuine anger, but he also treats it as raw material for entertainment. He creates scenes of painful seriousness, then surrounds them with jokes, music, and operatic violence. It is an unstable approach, occasionally insensitive and never comfortable, but it does give Django Unchained a perspective that is completely different from the solemn historical dramas normally made about this period. The film does not ask the audience only to mourn. It gives that anger somewhere to go, even if the destination is a fantasy soaked in blood. Django's transformation works because the film does not begin by treating him like the unstoppable hero he eventually becomes. When we first see him, he is barefoot, injured and chained to other enslaved men. He does not control the road he is walking on, the people surrounding him, or even the direction of his own life. For the opening minutes, he is spoken about more than he is spoken to. Then Schultz arrives and asks Django a question. It sounds simple, but being asked what he knows is already a change. Schultz needs Django because Django can identify the brittle brothers. For once, his memory and experience have value beyond what someone can extract from his body. The arrangement is still uncomfortable. Schultz technically purchases him before freeing him, but it creates the first opening through which Django can begin making choices. Jamie Foxx plays these early moments with very little dialogue. Django mostly watches Schultz, trying to understand what kind of man has just entered his life. He does not immediately relax because Schultz speaks politely or claims to dislike slavery. Why would he? Every white man Django has encountered has existed somewhere inside the same system. Schultz may be different, but Django has no reason to trust that difference yet. Foxx keeps him physically guarded. His expression stays controlled, his shoulders remain slightly tense, and his responses are direct. This is not a character waiting to deliver a dramatic speech about freedom. He has survived by reading situations carefully, and the film allows that instinct to remain visible even after his chains are removed. His first real step toward becoming the Django we remember comes with the Brittle brothers. These are not random bounty targets. They are tied directly to the abuse suffered by Django and Broomhilda, so the confrontation gives him something Schultz's legal paperwork cannot. The chance to answer personal violence with violence of his own. For Schultz, killing the brothers is business. Their faces are printed on a warrant, dead or alive. For Django, the moment is much more intimate. He is not simply identifying criminals so that someone else can collect a reward. He is standing in front of men who once had complete power over him, except the balance has suddenly reversed. Django has the weapon now. He has the authority, at least on paper, and the men who viewed him as property finally have to look at him as a threat. That reversal becomes the basic rhythm of his journey. Nearly every stage of the film gives Django something he was previously denied: a horse, money, clothing, a weapon, a profession, and eventually the ability to decide where he is going. The film makes a point of showing how strange these ordinary freedoms feel to him. His excitement when Schultz tells him he can choose his own clothes is almost innocent. It is a small scene, but it matters because Django has spent his life being denied control over the most basic parts of his identity. The first outfit he chooses is wildly extravagant, and the film does not treat that as a mistake. He has been given freedom without instructions, so naturally he expresses it loudly. The blue suit is funny at first. Django looks as though he has dressed himself using the imagination of someone who has only seen wealth from a distance. But Tarantino frames him with complete seriousness. On horseback, armed and dressed in bright clothing, Django becomes an image that the people around him can barely process. A black man riding through the South is already considered an insult to the social order. A black man choosing expensive clothes, carrying a gun, and looking white people directly in the eye feels almost impossible within that world. Tarantino presents him less like a historically ordinary figure and more like a superhero arriving in costume. The exaggeration is deliberate. Django's freedom has to look disruptive because, in that setting, it is. His clothing continues to evolve as his confidence grows. The bright blue suit gives way to the darker, cleaner image of a Western gunslinger. His posture changes too. He becomes more comfortable on horseback, more certain with a weapon, and less likely to wait for Schultz before acting. None of this happens through a training montage filled with inspirational speeches. We simply watch him become better. Schultz teaches him the practical rules of bounty hunting, but Django brings his own survival skills into the partnership. He already knows how to read danger. What Schultz gives him is a legal structure in which violence against white men can suddenly be rewarded rather than punished. When Django realizes he can kill fugitives and collect money for it, his reaction contains humor, disbelief, and something much deeper. The system that once treated him as property now contains a small loophole, and he intends to use it. Still, he does not become Schultz. Schultz handles confrontations through language. He explains warrants, performs politeness, and circles his target until the other person realizes too late that the conversation has already been decided. Django is quieter. He observes, waits, and then acts. That contrast makes them effective together, but it also keeps Django from disappearing beneath Waltz's much more talkative performance. There are scenes where Schultz clearly controls the room, yet the camera remains interested in Django's reactions. He listens with an almost boyish attention when Schultz tells him the German legend connected to Brunhilde's name. He leans forward, absorbed by the story. Moments like that are important because they reveal someone beneath the hardening gunslinger image. Django is not driven only by anger. He is driven by love, memory, and the stubborn belief that Brunhilde can still be found. That hope has survived even when the rest of his life was designed to destroy it. His devotion to her gives the revenge story its emotional center. Without Brunhilde, Django might simply continue collecting bounties with Schultz. He is good at it and appears to enjoy the freedom it gives him, but bounty hunting is never his final destination. Every skill he learns is eventually turned toward one purpose. That makes him heroic in the clearest sense. He is willing to enter an environment specifically designed to strip him of power because the person he loves is trapped there. Candyland is not just another dangerous location. It represents everything Django escaped: ownership, humiliation, and the assumption that black people can be controlled indefinitely. But the film does not make his heroism completely clean. To enter Candyland, Django must pretend to be a man who profits from slavery. He poses as a Mandingo expert who evaluates enslaved fighters for wealthy buyers. The role requires confidence, cruelty, and emotional distance. He cannot simply wear expensive clothes and remain silent. He has to convince Calvin Candy that he understands this business and shares its values. That is where Django becomes morally uncomfortable. He speaks harshly to enslaved people. He allows cruelty to continue in front of him. At one point, protecting the disguise means refusing to intervene when another man is condemned to a horrific death. Django knows exactly what is happening because he understands the victim's position better than anyone else present. He still chooses Brunhilde over him. The choice makes sense strategically. Showing compassion would expose Django and Schultz before they reach Candyland. Their entire plan could collapse, Broomhilda could be punished or moved, and Django might never get another opportunity. From that perspective, his silence is necessary. Emotionally, though, it is ugly. The film does not allow him to remain an uncomplicated savior who always chooses the morally perfect response. Django has a single mission, and he accepts that other people may suffer while he completes it. This separates him from the type of hero who fights for a universal cause. Django is not trying to overthrow slavery across the country. He is not even attempting to free everyone on Candy's plantation. His goal is personal. He wants his wife, and the limits of that goal become more visible as the story progresses. There is something selfish in it, but not in a way that destroys our sympathy. Django has spent his life having every personal bond treated as irrelevant. He and Broomhilda were deliberately separated because the people who owned them did not consider their marriage worthy of respect. His determination to recover her is therefore both intimate and rebellious. He insists that their relationship matters even when the entire system says it does not. At the same time, he can be frighteningly cold. Once violence begins, Django does not hesitate much. Some of his targets are clearly monsters, and the audience is encouraged to enjoy their deaths. Others are simply part of the machinery surrounding Candy. Django rarely pauses to separate moral guilt into careful categories. If someone stands between him and Broomhilda, that person becomes an obstacle. This is where the traditional Western hero model becomes useful. Classic gunslingers are often quiet men with personal codes rather than public moral philosophies. They arrive, identify the people responsible for an injustice, and settle the matter through force. Django fits that structure, but his history makes the familiar image feel different. He is adopting a kind of heroism that old Western cinema rarely allowed a black character to possess. Jamie Foxx understands that Django becomes more powerful when he says less. Waltz, DiCaprio, and Jackson receive the longer speeches and more theatrical scenes. Foxx has to construct much of Django through stillness. A glance at Broomhilda, the way he sits while Schultz tells a story, or the change in his walk after months of bounty hunting, all carry part of the performance. There is a danger that this restraint could make Django feel overshadowed in his own movie. At times, that does happen. Schultz is more immediately charming, Candy is more flamboyant, and Steven is louder and more unpredictable. They dominate individual scenes because they are designed to dominate them. Django's arc operates across the entire film rather than within one explosive monologue. His importance becomes clearer when Schultz is no longer there to lead him. Until the first Candyland confrontation, most of their major decisions come from Schultz. He buys Django, proposes the bounty-hunting partnership, finds Broomhilda, and creates the false Mandingo deal. Django participates and becomes increasingly capable, but he is still moving within a plan constructed by someone else. The extended final act forces him out of that protection. Once Django is captured and taken away, he has no legal papers, polished negotiator, or carefully designed scheme to rely on. He has to persuade the men transporting him that he is worth listening to. He lies convincingly, finds a weakness in their greed, and turns the situation around without Schultz's help. It is not just a demonstration of shooting ability. It proves that Django has learned how to manipulate people through language as well. His return to Candyland is therefore different from his first arrival. The first time, Schultz's plan grants him access. Django has to perform a role and keep himself under control. When he returns, he no longer asks permission to enter that world. He arrives on his own terms and openly identifies himself as the person everyone should fear. Structurally, the second return can feel excessive. The movie has already delivered an enormous shootout, and the story appears to be rebuilding itself for another ending. From Django's perspective, however, the repetition has a purpose. The first assault is the collapse of Schultz's plan. The second belongs entirely to him. He chooses who to confront, how to handle the remaining people, and when to destroy the plantation house. The mentor is gone, the disguise is finished, and the frightened man from the opening scene has almost disappeared. What remains is someone who can enter the place that once represented total power over him and reduce it to ruins. Even then, the film keeps his victory personal. Django does not stand in front of the plantation and deliver a speech about changing history. He reunites with Broomhilda. He shows off a little, because at this point he has earned the right to enjoy himself, and they leave together. That final confidence is a long way from the silence of the opening, but it is not a completely different personality. Django was always observant, patient, and determined. Freedom does not magically give him those qualities. It gives him room to use them. His transformation is really about access. Schultz gives him access to weapons, money, movement, and knowledge. Django turns those opportunities into independence. The film may exaggerate how quickly he becomes an elite gunslinger, but it takes the emotional progression seriously. First he follows, then he participates, and finally he leads. The moral ambiguity stays with him all the way through. Django's enemies are cruel enough that cheering for him is easy, but the methods he uses are not always gentle or selfless. He lies, kills, intimidates, and accepts collateral suffering. He is capable of tenderness toward Broomhilda and genuine affection toward Schultz, yet he can shut down his empathy when the mission demands it. That contradiction makes him more interesting than a symbol of uncomplicated revenge. Django is heroic because he refuses to remain what the world has declared him to be. He is morally uncertain because freedom does not automatically turn a person into a saint. It simply gives them the power to choose, and Django's choices are shaped by trauma, love, and a very focused desire to make the people responsible pay. By the end, he has become the fantasy promised by the film's Western imagery, a lone gunslinger who rides into a corrupt place, defeats the men who control it, and leaves with the woman he came to rescue. The difference is that Django begins the story as someone that same genre and historical period would normally leave in the background. Here, he takes the horse, the gun, and the final shot for himself. A strange thing happens when people discuss the performances in Django Unchained. Django is obviously the central character, yet Jamie Foxx is rarely the first actor mentioned. That honor usually goes to Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, or Samuel L. Jackson, all of whom are given louder personalities, longer speeches, and more obvious showcase moments. That does not mean Foxx is doing less. His job is simply different. Django spends much of the film surrounded by men who enjoy controlling conversations. Schultz can turn a basic explanation into an elegant speech. Candy treats every dinner table discussion like a performance staged for his own amusement. Stephen barely needs a full sentence to change the atmosphere of a room. Foxx has to hold the center of the film without trying to compete with any of them on those terms. He plays Django as a man who watches first. Early on, his answers are short and cautious, partly because he does not yet know what Schultz wants from him. Even after receiving his freedom, he does not suddenly become relaxed or openly expressive. He has spent too much of his life in situations where saying the wrong thing could bring punishment. That instinct does not disappear because one unusually polite bounty hunter hands him a coat and puts him on a horse. Foxx keeps that history present without constantly advertising it. There is tension in the way Django studies people. He rarely looks confused, even when he is unfamiliar with the world Schultz is introducing to him. He is calculating, listening, figuring out where the danger is and whether the person speaking has already underestimated him. As Django gains experience, Foxx changes the performance gradually. His posture becomes firmer. His voice loses some of its uncertainty. He starts walking into rooms as though he expects other people to move out of his way. It is not a dramatic overnight transformation, even if his skill with a gun develops at movie speed. The confidence arrives in pieces. That restraint is what makes his later moments work. When Django finally takes control, it feels like something that has been building beneath the surface rather than a new personality appearing for the final act. Foxx does not need to give a huge speech announcing that Django has changed. The way he carries himself already tells us. Still, it is easy to understand why Waltz attracts so much attention. Dr. King Schultz is almost perfectly designed for Christoph Waltz's strengths. He is educated, theatrical, endlessly courteous, and capable of explaining something horrifying in the tone of a man discussing the weather. Waltz gives every sentence a precise rhythm. He seems to enjoy the shape of the words as much as their meaning. That could become irritating in the hands of an actor trying too hard to sound clever. Waltz avoids that because Schultz's politeness is not only decoration, it is how he controls situations. He enters hostile spaces looking harmless, speaks calmly while everyone else becomes agitated, and waits for the exact moment when his legal paperwork or hidden weapon gives him the advantage. One of the pleasures of the performance is watching Schultz maintain his manners even when violence has become unavoidable. He can shoot a man, explain why the man deserved to be shot, and then return to business without noticeably changing his tone. The calmness makes him funny, but it also makes him dangerous. Waltz had already played a highly intelligent, talkative figure for Tarantino in Inglourious Basterds, so there was a risk that Schultz might feel like a friendlier variation of Hans Landa. There are obvious similarities in the controlled speech and ability to dominate a conversation. The emotional effect is completely different, though. Schultz uses his intelligence to expose hypocrisy rather than protect it. He understands that the law surrounding him is deeply unjust, yet he also knows how to manipulate that law better than the men who benefit from it. His legal documents become a kind of weapon. People may hate seeing Django on horseback, but Schultz takes visible pleasure in reminding them that their own rules allow it. The relationship between Schultz and Django works because the actors do not force the friendship. At first, Walt speaks and Foxx reacts. Schultz is the one with the plan, the money, and the experience. Django is useful to him, but he is also dependent on him. As the story progresses, the balance changes almost without either character acknowledging it. Schultz begins treating Django less like an assistant and more like a partner. Foxx, in return, becomes more comfortable challenging him or acting without waiting for instructions. Their friendship grows through shared work, small moments of humor, and the simple fact that Schultz respects Django's desire to find Broomhilda. They are also genuinely enjoyable to watch together. Schultz fills silence because he cannot seem to help himself. Django uses silence as a tool. One man negotiates his way toward violence. The other often looks ready to skip the negotiation. The difference gives their scenes a loose, natural rhythm. Waltz may have the more immediately entertaining role, but Foxx prevents Schultz from carrying the film away. Django's stillness gives the audience somewhere to focus while Schultz performs. The two styles balance rather than cancel each other out. Then Leonardo DiCaprio arrives, and the entire film changes temperature. Calvin Candy is introduced late enough that the movie has already developed a comfortable rhythm around Django and Schultz. DiCaprio disrupts it almost immediately. Candy is charming in the shallowest possible way. He smiles, welcomes people into his world, and behaves as though his wealth has made him fascinating. Underneath that performance is a man who has never had to control his worst instincts. DiCaprio is particularly good at showing Candy's need to be admired. He does not simply want money from Schultz. He wants Schultz to recognize him as sophisticated. He wants Django to behave according to the racial order he believes is natural. He wants everyone at the table to accept that the conversation belongs to him. The problem is that Candy is not nearly as intelligent as he thinks he is. He collects pieces of culture, repeats ideas that make him sound educated, and surrounds himself with people who praise him. The performance becomes more unsettling because DiCaprio never plays him as a snarling villain from the beginning. Candy enjoys himself. He is amused by violence and comfortable with cruelty because nobody around him has ever forced him to question either. That smiling ease is far more effective than constant shouting would have been. When Candy finally loses control, the outburst feels like the exposure of something that has always been there. The manners vanish, and what remains is a spoiled, vicious man furious that someone has made him look foolish. DiCaprio's performance also works because it is so different from Waltz's. Both characters enjoy language and see themselves as cultured men, but Schultz's intelligence is real. Candy's sophistication is mostly a costume. Schultz can enter an unfamiliar situation and understand the rules quickly. Candy needs to remain inside a world designed to confirm his importance. Schultz's courtesy reflects discipline. Candy's politeness lasts only as long as everyone continues flattering him. Their scenes become a contest between two men who recognize something false in each other. Schultz is pretending to be interested in purchasing a fighter. Candy is pretending that his money and manners make him civilized. Both performances gradually become harder to maintain. The dinner sequence gives DiCaprio his largest opportunity, and he takes it. Candy moves between amusement, wounded pride, and genuine menace without making those changes feel mechanical. He enjoys revealing that he knows about the deception because it restores the sense of superiority he nearly lost. There is almost something childish about him. Not innocent, nothing close to that, but emotionally immature. He needs to win the room. The moment he feels mocked, the business discussion becomes punishment. And just when it seems as though DiCaprio will dominate the entire Candyland section, Samuel Jackson enters and quietly reveals that Candy may not be the sharpest person in his own house. Stephen is one of the most uncomfortable characters in the film because the performance operates on two levels at once. On the surface, Jackson exaggerates the physical mannerisms and speech of an elderly house servant. He complains loudly, bends his body, and behaves with almost theatrical outrage at the sight of Django riding beside white men. Some of it is very funny. Jackson knows exactly how far to push a reaction, and the film clearly uses Stephen for comedy when he first appears. But the humor begins to feel different once we understand how much power he actually has. Stephen is not merely an old servant grumbling in the background. He watches everything. He understands Candy, the household, and the plantation's racial hierarchy better than anyone else. Candy may own Candyland, but Stephen helps the place function. Jackson gradually straightens the character without making a show of it. Away from the larger group, Stephen's voice becomes firmer and his thinking becomes clearer. The exaggerated servant persona starts to look partly strategic, a role he has performed for so long that it may no longer be possible to separate it completely from his real identity. That shift is what makes him dangerous. Candy is too busy enjoying Schultz's attention to notice the connection between Django and Broomhilda. Steven sees it almost immediately. He notices the looks, the tension, and the way Django's behavior changes around her. There is a sharp intelligence underneath the comic exterior, and Jackson lets it emerge at exactly the right pace. Django wants Broomhilda back. Everything else is preparation, disguise, obstruction, or retaliation. The film survives its length because the journey keeps changing form. It begins as a road movie, becomes a bounty-hunting adventure, settles into a tense infiltration story, and finally explodes into revenge. Some sections are stronger than others. The opening partnership between Django and Schultz may be the most immediately enjoyable part of the film. There is an ease to their scenes that makes the movie feel lighter than its subject suggests. Waltz gets to play with Tarantino's dialogue. Foxx gradually grows into the Western hero role, and the audience is allowed to enjoy Django's freedom before Candyland turns the story darker. The Candyland material contains the film's strongest performances and most serious ideas, but it is also where the pacing becomes less disciplined. Tarantino lets DiCaprio, Jackson, and Waltz stretch scenes because he knows they are fascinating to watch. Usually, he is right. Occasionally, the movie begins admiring the performance instead of advancing the story. That is a recurring issue in Tarantino's later work. His confidence as a writer has become so strong that he sometimes treats editing like an unnecessary restriction. Earlier films could be talkative, but the dialogue often felt cut to its sharpest possible form. In Django Unchained, there are moments where the conversation remains compelling even after its purpose is clear. It is not a fatal problem here. The actors are too good, and the underlying tension is too strong. Still, the looseness prevents the film from reaching the near-perfect control of his best work. Pulp Fiction remains more formally inventive. Its fragmented structure turns chronology into part of the experience, and its conversations often reveal character without announcing their importance. Kill Bill is more visually concentrated, almost entirely committed to its genre mythology. Inglourious B is probably the closest comparison because both films transform historical atrocity into fantasy revenge. Of the two, Inglourious B feels tighter and more cunning. Its major dialogue scenes are built like traps. The audience can sense danger in every pause, and when violence arrives, it feels both sudden and inevitable. Django Unchained is more direct. Its emotions are simpler, its hero's objective is clearer, and its revenge is less interested in surprise than satisfaction. It may not be as clever, but it is arguably easier to connect with. Django's desire to rescue his wife gives the film a personal line that remains understandable, even when Tarantino surrounds it with detours. There is also more uncomplicated pleasure in watching Django become powerful. That may sound strange given the subject, but the film refuses to define its black protagonist only through suffering. Django experiences cruelty, humiliation, and loss, yet the story also gives him style, humor, competence, and eventually complete control over the final act. He is not merely someone history has harmed. He becomes a Western hero inside a genre that would traditionally have pushed someone like him to the edge of the frame. That choice is one of the film's greatest strengths. The treatment of slavery remains more difficult to evaluate. Tarantino clearly despises the world he is depicting, and the most serious scenes carry genuine anger. Candyland is not romanticized. Calvin Candy's manners do not hide his moral emptiness, and the film gives the audience every reason to want the plantation destroyed. At the same time, the movie is still entertainment. Historical suffering becomes the fuel for jokes, action, and revenge catharsis. The violence inflicted on enslaved people creates the anger that later makes Django's bloodshed feel satisfying. For some viewers, that is precisely why the film works. It does not ask the audience to observe oppression with solemn distance. It turns anger into retaliation and gives Django the kind of victory that history rarely provided. For others, the same approach will feel exploitative. The film uses a real system of cruelty to support an exaggerated fantasy, then invites the audience to enjoy the release. That discomfort cannot be solved by saying Tarantino intended the film as exploitation cinema. Intention explains the style, but it does not automatically make every choice tasteful. The film is strongest when it acknowledges that discomfort rather than hiding from it. Django is not presented as morally perfect. Schultz's manners cannot protect him from the reality of Candyland. Steven complicates the racial dynamic by becoming both a victim of the plantation system and one of its most committed defenders. Those details prevent the story from becoming completely simplistic, even though the final revenge still depends on clear villains and emotional certainty. The performances do an enormous amount of work. Christoph Waltz gives the film charm, rhythm, and a moral viewpoint that remains more complicated than simple heroism. Jamie Foxx has the less verbal role, but his restraint helps the transformation feel physical rather than constantly explained. Leonardo DiCaprio appears later and immediately creates one of the most unpleasant characters of his career without turning Candy into a humorless monster. Samuel L. Jackson may have the hardest role. Stephen is broad, funny, intelligent, and deeply disturbing. The performance risks caricature, yet Jackson gradually reveals how much awareness exists underneath the character's exaggerated surface. Kerry Washington receives less material than the others, but Broomhilda gives the story its emotional reason for existing. Without her suffering and Django's devotion, the film could easily collapse into a sequence of stylish killings. That cast is one reason the movie remains so rewatchable. Individual scenes can be revisited almost as performances on their own. Schultz explaining a bounty, Candy controlling the dinner table, Stephen recognizing the deception, or Django silently watching a room before deciding what to do. The soundtrack and visual design strengthen that replay value. Tarantino's choices are sometimes jarring, especially when modern music collides with Western imagery, but they are never timid. The film contains images that remain recognizable long after the exact plot details fade. Django in the blue suit, Schultz's giant tooth wagon, Candy's dinner table, and the Candyland mansion covered in the evidence of its own violence. There are directors who make cleaner movies. Few make movies this unmistakably theirs. That is why calling Django Unchained self-indulgent is both criticism and description. Tarantino includes scenes that a stricter editor might remove. He gives himself a cameo that the film does not need. He extends the ending after already staging a natural climax. He chooses music because the collision excites him, even when it risks breaking the period atmosphere. The frustrating part is that many of those indulgences are entertaining. A more disciplined version would almost certainly be shorter and smoother. It might also lose the strange looseness that allows the film to feel like an entire evening spent inside Tarantino's version of cinema history. The detours, cameos, and tonal collisions are part of the experience, even when they prevent the film from becoming perfectly shaped. Awards recognition for the screenplay and performances makes sense because the film is full of strong writing and difficult acting. Whether it deserved to be considered among the absolute best films of its year is more debatable. Its ambition is undeniable, but ambition and control are not the same thing. Waltz is the easiest awards case. Schultz is written with extraordinary precision for his abilities, and the performance gives the movie much of its warmth. DiCaprio and Jackson receive more explosive moments, while Foxx has to carry the central arc without the same amount of verbal showmanship. Tarantino's screenplay is brilliant in individual scenes and less impressive as an overall structure. That sounds contradictory, but it fits the movie. The writing can be sharp, funny, and tense from minute to minute, while the full narrative still feels overextended. So is Django Unchained a masterpiece? Not quite, at least not in the same controlled sense as Tarantino's finest work. There are too many visible cracks. The middle stretches, the double climax weakens the ending, and the tone occasionally shifts faster than the material can support. But not a masterpiece can sound more negative than it should. This is still a bold, funny, upsetting, and unusually entertaining film made by a director with complete command of his cinematic personality. It contains several career-best performances, memorable dialogue, striking imagery, and a revenge story with genuine emotional force. More importantly, the excess rarely feels generic. Even the mistakes belong specifically to Tarantino. The film is overlong in a Tarantino way, violent in a Tarantino way, and too pleased with its own references in a Tarantino way. That can be exhausting, but it also means the movie possesses an identity that polished studio productions often lack. Within his filmography, it sits below the precision of Pulp Fiction and Inglourious B, but comfortably above the projects where indulgence overwhelms momentum completely. It may not be his smartest film, yet it could be one of his most immediately satisfying. There is something difficult to resist about its confidence. Tarantino takes a subject that would normally demand solemn treatment and filters it through Western mythology, exploitation cinema, and revenge fantasy. The result is often irresponsible, occasionally brilliant, and almost impossible to mistake for anyone else's work. Its greatest strength and most obvious weakness are really the same thing. Tarantino never knows when enough is enough. In Django Unchained, enough would probably have made a tighter film. Too much made the film people still remember.